What if every goal you've ever chased was never really yours to begin with? Marcus had a list for everything. The day he was born, someone started one for him. And the list never really stopped. But on the morning his plan finally fell apart, he sat very still at his kitchen table and asked himself a question he had never dared to ask before. A question so simple it almost felt embarrassing. What do I actually want? The coffee in front of him had gone cold. He didn't notice. It was a Tuesday in early autumn, the kind of morning where the light comes in sideways, pale and thin, touching everything but warming nothing. Marcus was 32 years old. He had a good apartment, a good job title, a resume that looked exactly the way resumes are supposed to look. And yet, sitting there in the quiet, he felt something he could not quite name. Not sadness exactly, not failure, something closer to empty. The night before, his manager had called him into a glass-walled meeting room and told him, with a careful smile, that the VP position, the one Marcus had been building toward for 3 years, was going to someone else. Someone younger, actually. Someone who had only been at the company for 14 months. Marcus had nodded. He had said, "I understand." He had walked back to his desk, shut down his computer, and gone home on the train without remembering a single stop. This is the story of what happened after that train ride. And in many ways, it is a story about what we discover when the plan we have been following suddenly stops working. And we are forced, for the first time, to look at the road beneath our feet and ask who actually chose this direction. This story is built around the ideas in a remarkable book called Tiny Experiments by Anne-Laure Le Cunff. A book that asks one of the most unsettling questions a person can face. What if the goals you have been chasing were never really yours to begin with? Marcus had always been good at following plans. In school, he knew what grades he needed. In university, he knew what internships would look good on paper. In his 20s, he knew which companies to target, which skills to build, which boxes to check. He had been taught, the way most of us are taught, that life is a kind of road with clear milestones. You reach each milestone by working hard, staying focused, and not getting distracted by things that do not fit the plan. The plan felt safe. It felt like progress. It felt like meaning. But now, sitting at his kitchen table with cold coffee and a Tuesday morning, stretching silently ahead of him, Marcus realized something uncomfortable. He had been so focused on reaching the milestones that he had never once stopped to ask if the road itself was his own. He didn't go to the office that day. He told himself he needed to think. So he walked, without a direction, without a destination, just walked through the city, past bakeries just opening their shutters, past children with heavy school bags, past a small park where an old man sat on a bench feeding birds with quiet, unhurried patience. Marcus sat down on the far end of the same bench. The old man glanced at him. "Day off?" he asked. "Something like that," Marcus said. The old man nodded slowly. "You look like someone who just finished a race," he said, "and isn't sure what to do with his hands." Marcus almost laughed. "That's about right. My granddaughter says I'm obsessive about my balcony plants," the old man said, apparently changing the subject entirely. "Says I treat the whole thing like a laboratory." He smiled to himself. "She's not wrong. Every season I try something new. A different soil, a different amount of light. I don't know if it will work." He paused. "That's the point. I want to find out." Something about the way he said those last four words stayed with Marcus long after he left the park. I want to find out. He went home and did something he hadn't done in years. He sat with no agenda, no task list, no podcast, no emails to answer. Just sat. And in that quiet, slightly uncomfortable space, he began to think about his life. Not the resume version, not the professional version, but the real version. The one that existed before anyone was watching. He thought about how he had chosen his career path. Had he chosen it? Or had he simply followed what seemed like the logical next step? Then the next, until one day the steps had become a corridor so narrow he couldn't see any other direction. He thought about the things he had quietly set aside over the years. The drawing he used to do on weekend mornings. The language he had started learning and abandoned after 3 weeks because it wasn't useful. The long cycling trip he had been planning for 5 years and never taken. Each one had been set aside for the sake of the plan. They had seemed like small losses at the time. One small thing set aside, then another. But now, sitting alone in the quiet, the weight of all of them together felt enormous. He opened a blank notebook, an old one he found in a drawer, half filled with project notes, and turned to the first empty page. He wrote 2 words at the top. Tiny experiments. He didn't know exactly why he wrote that. Something about the old man in the park. Something about the idea of trying without knowing the outcome. Of finding out rather than succeeding. And then, slowly, he began to write a list. But not the kind of list he was used to writing. Not a plan, not a roadmap, not goals with deadlines attached. Just questions. When did I last do something purely because I was curious about it? What would I do on a Tuesday morning if I had complete freedom? What does success mean to me? Not to anyone else, just to me. He stared at the questions. He didn't have the answers. And for the first time in a long time, that felt interesting rather than frightening. The next few weeks were strange. Marcus went back to work. He did his job. He sat in meetings and answered emails and appeared, from the outside, exactly the same as before. But inside, something had shifted. A question had opened, like a door left slightly ajar, and he could feel the air moving through it. He started small, almost ridiculously small. On a Wednesday evening, instead of going straight home from work, he took a different route. Just that, a different street. He walked through a neighborhood he had never been in, past a small bookshop with a handwritten sign in the window that said, "Simply come in. We have tea." He went in. An hour later, he came out with 2 books he hadn't planned to buy and a conversation about marine biology that he hadn't expected to enjoy. He felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Light. Almost buzzing. He wrote it down when he got home. Not a big analysis. Just 3 words in his notebook. Unexpected. Interesting. Good. This was the beginning. He didn't fully understand it yet, but he was learning something the book describes as one of the most important shifts a person can make. The difference between a goal and a pact. A goal says, I will achieve this specific thing by this specific date. It ties your sense of success, your sense of worth, to a fixed outcome. When you reach the goal, you win. When you don't, you fail. The system is completely binary, pass or fail. And Marcus had been living inside that binary his entire adult life. A pact is different. A pact says, I will commit to this process for this period of time and I will pay careful attention to what I discover. There is no pass or fail in a pact. There is only what you learn. The commitment is real. It takes real discipline, but the destination remains open. You are running an experiment, not racing toward a finish line. Marcus didn't have the words for this yet, but he was beginning to feel the difference in his body. He made his first proper experiment 3 weeks after the Tuesday in the park. He had always been slightly interested in photography. Years before the career plan consumed everything, he used to photograph things he found interesting. The details of old buildings, shadows on walls, the way light changed through a window in late afternoon. He had stopped. There was no career in it, no logical use for it. So it had quietly disappeared. Now he made a pact with himself. Simple. Clear. For 30 days, I will take one photograph every day. Not professional photographs, not impressive ones. Just one photograph of something I notice. That was all. 30 days, one photo a day. No goal attached, no outcome promised. He expected it to feel trivial. It did not. Within the first week, he found himself looking at the world differently. Really looking. He noticed the color of the sky at 7 in the morning. He noticed the way old paint peels back in layers, each layer a different year, a different choice made by someone long ago. He noticed the face of a woman on the train who was reading something that made her smile without being aware of it. The photographs were ordinary. Some of them were frankly not very good. He didn't care. That was the surprising part. He genuinely did not care whether the photographs were good. He was interested in the noticing. The practice of paying attention had become its own reward. This is what the book calls an atelic activity. Atelic is a word that comes from the Greek word for without end. An atelic activity is one that doesn't aim at a fixed endpoint. You do it not to finish it, but because the doing itself has value. Walking a beautiful road, not to arrive somewhere, but simply to walk. Playing music not to perform for anyone, but just to play. Following an idea not to prove a point, but just to think. Marcus had spent his whole career doing the opposite, doing things with clear endpoints, clear goals, clear conditions for success. He had forgotten what it felt like to do something purely for its own sake. The photography experiment was teaching him that forgotten feeling. But experiments don't always go smoothly. That is the nature of them. Around day 18, Marcus hit something he didn't expect. He came home from a long, exhausting day at work, slightly irritable, and realized he had forgotten to take a photo. He pulled out his phone, walked to the window, and snapped a blurry, rushed picture of the street below. Just to say he had done it. He put his phone down. He stared at the notebook on his table. Something felt wrong. Not the broken habit, the reason for breaking it. He had taken that photograph not because he wanted to notice something. He had taken it because he felt he had to. Because he was afraid of missing a day. He had turned a curiosity experiment into another obligation, another box to check, another way to judge himself. He sat with that feeling for a while. And then he understood something important. The experiment was never really about the photographs. The photographs were a door. What mattered was what walked through that door, his relationship with attention, with noticing, with choosing to be present in his own life. The moment the practice became mechanical, the moment it became performance, it lost its entire point. He wrote in his notebook, "The pact is not the point. The pact is a door. What matters is what you walk through." This is one of the book's core ideas. Experiments are not tasks to be completed. They are invitations to notice. And what you notice tells you something deeply true about who you are, what you actually value, and what kind of life genuinely fits you, as opposed to the life that looks good from a distance. Most people never run this kind of honest experiment. They are too afraid that what they discover about themselves won't be impressive enough, or useful enough, or serious enough. So they keep following plans that others have approved of, and they call it having direction. Marcus started talking to people differently around this time. He had always been polite but somewhat guarded in conversation. He asked the expected questions. He gave the expected answers. He kept things professional and comfortable. Now, having spent weeks in a kind of quiet self-examination, he found himself genuinely curious about other people's hidden experiments, the things they had always wanted to explore but never had permission to. He asked a colleague, a quiet woman named Sasha, who always seemed slightly too thoughtful for her job description, what she would do if her career disappeared tomorrow. She looked startled. Then she thought about it seriously and said she had always wanted to understand how birds navigate. Not do anything professional with it, just understand it. Like, how do they know where to go, she said. They just know how. Marcus thought about that for days. He thought about how many people were walking around with questions exactly like that. Beautiful, impractical, wonderful questions that they had never told anyone because there was no professional context for them, no application, no career path, just curiosity, just the deep human desire to understand something. He began to think he had been choosing the wrong kind of questions to live by. Midwinter arrived. Marcus had been keeping the notebook for almost 4 months. He read back through it, the questions at the beginning, the photography pact, the conversations, the small strange discoveries. It looked nothing like a career plan. It looked more like a field journal, the kind a scientist might keep while studying a new and unfamiliar environment. He understood suddenly that this was exactly the right comparison. The book talks about this directly, the idea of becoming a scientist of your own life, not in a cold or clinical way, but in the sense of approaching your own experience with genuine curiosity rather than judgment. When a scientist runs an experiment and the results aren't what they expected, they don't call themselves a failure. They call it data. Interesting data. Data that tells them something they didn't know before. Marcus had been living the opposite way. Every plan that didn't work, every goal he missed, every unexpected detour in his life had felt like a verdict, a judgment on his personal value. He had been treating himself not as a human being to be understood, but as a product to be evaluated. The shift in perspective was subtle, but it changed everything. He started asking different questions when things went wrong. Not, why did I fail, but what did I learn? Not, what does this say about me? But what is this showing me about what I actually need? These questions felt gentler, and somehow, because they were gentler, they were also far more honest. Here in the middle of Marcus's story, I want to pause for just a moment, not to explain a lesson, but to ask you, the person listening to this right now, one simple question. When did you last do something purely because you wanted to find out what would happen? Not to achieve anything, not to impress anyone, not to build towards something else. Just to find out. Hold that question. Marcus held it too. Spring came slowly to the city. Marcus's company launched an internal program. Employees could propose small projects outside their usual roles. Most of his colleagues rolled their eyes and called it a distraction. Marcus signed up immediately. He proposed something he had never done before. He wanted to explore whether the company's onboarding process for new employees could be made more human, less like a procedure, more like a story. He had no expertise in this, no track record. He wasn't even entirely sure it was a good idea, but he was curious about it in a way that felt real and alive, not performed, not strategic, genuinely alive. His manager looked doubtful. "This isn't exactly in your lane," she said. "I know," said Marcus. "That's why I want to try it." She approved it partly because the program required 3 submissions, and they only had 2. Marcus threw himself into the experiment and immediately discovered how much he didn't know. He talked to new hires about their first weeks at the company. He listened carefully to things they had been afraid to say in official feedback sessions. He tried one version of a new welcome guide, revised it based on what he heard, then tried again. He failed in small ways constantly. A version he was proud of turned out to be confusing. An approach he thought was fresh turned out to have been tried 3 years earlier. He had to start over. He had to ask for help from people who knew more than him. And here is what surprised him most. He didn't mind any of it, because he had stopped measuring himself against a fixed outcome. He was curious about the process. Each failure gave him information. Each revision taught him something he hadn't known before. The experiment wasn't a bet he could win or lose, but it was a conversation he was having with reality. And reality was answering him patiently, one small discovery at a time. This is one of the book's deepest ideas. The goal-obsessed mind treats uncertainty as a threat. "I don't know if this will work" feels like a problem to be solved as quickly as possible. But the experimental mind treats uncertainty as information waiting to be gathered. "I don't know if this will work" becomes, "I wonder what I'm about to find out." The distance between those two responses is enormous. One closes down, the other opens up. By late spring, Marcus's onboarding project had quietly become something real. Several of his ideas were being used across the company, not because he had forced them through or made a big argument for them, but because they had worked. Small experiment, real result. His manager called him in for a conversation, not about a promotion, just to ask how he had approached the project. He told her about the questions he'd been asking himself, the notebook, the small experiments, the idea of treating his own life the way a scientist treats a research question, with curiosity, patience, and no rigid attachment to a particular answer. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something he hadn't expected at all. "I think I've been managing you wrong," she said. "I've been giving you goals when I should have been giving you permission." Marcus thought about that word for a long time after he left her office. Permission. What a strange word for something that should feel simple. The book addresses this directly. One of the deepest patterns it identifies is what it calls the achievement trap. From a very young age, most of us are taught to measure our value by external things: grades, titles, approval, comparison with others. We learn to seek validation from outside ourselves. We internalize the measurements of other people, and slowly, quietly, we begin to call those measurements our own goals. The trap is subtle because the measurements that often feel real and important. A promotion feels like success. A missed target feels like failure. The emotions are genuine, but underneath them there is a question we have almost never been taught to ask. Whose measuring stick is this? Who decided that this, exactly this, is what a good life looks like? Marcus had been using someone else's measuring stick his entire professional life. Not because he was unthinking or weak, but because no one had ever suggested there was another way. The world around him had quietly agreed, collectively, on what success was supposed to look like. And he had agreed too, without ever realizing he was making an agreement. Now, slowly, he was beginning to build his own measurements. Rougher, less certain, harder to explain to anyone at a dinner party, but genuinely, undeniably his. Summer arrived. Marcus had a different quality of attention now. He noticed things he used to walk straight past. He was slower, more curious, less driven, in the old anxious way, but somehow more present, more awake. He started a new experiment. He had always been slightly interested in cooking, but had never done more than the basics. He decided to try cooking something genuinely difficult every Sunday evening, not to become a chef, not to document it for anyone, just to spend 2 hours on a Sunday afternoon learning to do something challenging with his hands. The first Sunday, he made pasta from scratch. It was not good. The second Sunday, it was better. By the fourth Sunday, it was very good, and he ate it standing at the kitchen counter, looking out at the city in the warm late afternoon light, feeling something he could only describe as simple, uncomplicated happiness. Not the happiness of achieving a goal, not the happiness of being seen or recognized, the happiness of being completely absorbed in something real, of being fully present for 2 hours in the physical world. Flour on his hands, the smell of olive oil, the sound of water beginning to boil. The book describes this state through the work of the psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who called it flow. Flow is the experience of being so fully engaged in an activity that time seems to disappear. Self-consciousness fades. You stop thinking about how you look or what anyone thinks, or whether you are doing it right. You are simply doing it. Marcus had felt this before briefly in rare moments of very good work, but he had never understood how to find his way there. The small Sunday experiment taught him something important about it. Flow doesn't come from pressure. It doesn't come from forcing yourself toward a deadline or a goal. It comes from genuine engagement, from doing something that is just challenging enough to be interesting, but not so difficult it overwhelms you. The sweet spot between boredom and panic. And critically, you cannot plan your way into flow. You can only experiment your way there. Autumn came again. 1 full year since Marcus had sat at his kitchen table with cold coffee and a question he couldn't answer. He opened the notebook and read it from the beginning. It took an entire evening. What he found surprised him. Not the individual entries. He remembered most of those. But the arc. The shape of the whole year, seen all at once. When he read it as one continuous story, he could see something he hadn't been able to see while living it. He could see the person he had been slowly, quietly becoming. Not dramatically. Not the way transformation happens in films, with one big turning point and music swelling underneath it. But incrementally, microscopically, like a plant growing. One small experiment, then another. Each one teaching him something small, and the small things, accumulated over months, had added up to something quite large. He thought about the idea of identity. Most people think of identity as something fixed, something you are born with or choose once when you are young and then protect. But the book suggests something different and far more honest. Identity is not a destination. Identity is a practice. It is built day by day through the choices you make, the questions you keep asking yourself, and the experiments you are willing to run. Who are you? You are the sum of what you repeatedly do and what you repeatedly choose to pay attention to, which means, and this was the thought that made Marcus sit very still for a long moment, you are always, always in the process of becoming, not finished, not arrived, becoming. He had spent the first 32 years of his life trying to arrive somewhere, trying to become the finished version of himself, the successful version, the version that proved he had been worth something all along. He had been chasing a completed self. But what if there was no arrived? What if the whole point was the becoming? He called his mother that evening. They were close but busy, the way families become busy without meaning to. She asked how he was, and he thought carefully before answering. I think I'm figuring out the difference between the life I was supposed to have and the life I actually want, he said. There was a pause on the line. That took me until I was 53, she said quietly. You're doing well. The winter that followed was quieter than the one before. Marcus worked. He cooked on Sunday afternoons. He took photographs sometimes. Not every day, not as a formal experiment anymore, just when something caught his attention. He kept the notebook, though less religiously now, more like correspondence with himself than a formal record of anything. He had begun to internalize the habit of questioning, of noticing, of staying genuinely curious about his own experience. He had also started saying no differently. Before, saying no had felt like closing a door, like missing an opportunity, like falling behind. Now he understood something the book is very clear about. Every yes is also a no to something else. Every commitment is a choice about where to place your limited time and attention. He had learned to ask himself before saying yes to anything, does this feel like genuine curiosity, or does this feel like obligation? Does this fit who I am actually becoming, or just who I used to think I was supposed to become? The answer changed his decisions. He turned down a project that would have looked impressive on paper, but felt hollow in his chest. He said yes to a weekend training program in visual communication, a field he knew almost nothing about, because reading the description made him feel a specific, uncomfortable excitement. The kind of excitement that lives right next to the fear of being bad at something new. He was learning to trust that feeling. The discomfort of genuine curiosity. He had spent years staying inside his area of competence, staying safe, staying credible. Now he understood what the book says so plainly. Growth doesn't happen inside your competence. It happens at the edge of it. The following spring, something unexpected happened. Marcus was asked to give a short talk at a company-wide meeting about his experience with the Onboarding Innovation Project. He prepared for it, but not in his usual way. He didn't build a presentation full of statistics and outcomes and slides about methodology. He just told the story. The cold coffee on the Tuesday morning, the old man feeding birds in the park, the photography experiment on day 18 when he understood he had turned curiosity into obligation, the pasta on Sunday afternoon, the notebook. He talked for 12 minutes. When he stopped, the room was quiet in a way that felt different from normal meeting room quiet. It was the quiet of people thinking. Then someone near the back of the room raised her hand. He didn't know her. She worked in a department he had never had any reason to interact with. "I've been waiting to hear someone say something like this for a long time," she said. He didn't know what to do with that. He just nodded. Afterward, several people came up to ask him questions. Not about the onboarding project specifically, about the method, about how to run experiments in your own life, about how to ask better questions when you're not sure what you want, about how to step off a path that doesn't feel right without having another path already perfectly mapped out in advance. Marcus gave the best answers he could, which were mostly more questions, because that, he had learned, was the most honest answer he had. There is a moment near the end of most experiments when you look at what you have discovered and try to understand what it actually means. Not to conclude everything neatly, not to file the matter away as finished, but to genuinely sit with it and ask, what did I learn? What does this change? What is the next question? Marcus had that moment in early summer, standing on a rooftop terrace where a friend was having a small gathering. The city spread out below him, warm and lit and vast. He had a drink in his hand that he wasn't really tasting. He was thinking. He was thinking that 1 year ago he had been told he did not get the promotion he had been building toward for 3 years. He had walked home on a train without remembering a single stop. He had sat at a kitchen table with cold coffee and asked himself, for the first time, what he actually wanted. And here was what he had discovered through a year of small experiments and small, honest moments. He didn't want the promotion, not the way he had thought. He had wanted what the promotion represented. Proof. Proof that he had been good enough. Proof that the years of discipline had meant something. Proof that he had measured up by the standards that had been placed around him since childhood. But proof from outside is the wrong currency. It solves nothing. The VP title, had he received it, would have given him a salary and 2 weeks of satisfaction before the measuring started all over again. Before the next goal appeared on the horizon and the race quietly resumed. What he had actually wanted, what he had always wanted underneath the plan, was to feel genuinely interested in his own life. To feel that what he was doing on an ordinary Tuesday morning, or a Wednesday afternoon, or a Sunday evening, was connected to something real inside him. Not impressive from the outside, real from the inside. That was what the experiments had given him. Not a new destination, a new relationship with the journey itself. He didn't find a purpose that year. He found something he came to believe was better than purpose. He found curiosity. The book is thoughtful and honest about this. Purpose is often sold to us as a fixed thing, a calling, a North Star, the one reason you are here. But chasing a fixed purpose can trap you just as completely as chasing a fixed goal. What if your purpose changes? What if you are genuinely interested in different things at different seasons of your life? Does that mean you have failed to find your real purpose? Or does it mean you are actually paying attention? Curiosity is different. Curiosity doesn't require a destination. It doesn't need to be justified to anyone. It doesn't demand that you have everything figured out in advance. It simply asks, what is genuinely interesting to you right now? And then, what would you discover if you followed that? Marcus had spent years afraid of those questions, afraid that what interested him wasn't serious enough, not strategic enough, not impressive enough to defend to the people whose approval he had been quietly chasing. Now he understood that the fear itself had been the real problem, not the answer. the fear of the answer. When you stop being afraid of what you might discover about yourself, the experiments become lighter. The results become interesting rather than threatening. The failures become genuinely data, information, one more honest data point in the most important study you will ever run. It was late summer when Marcus made a decision. He was going to leave his company, not because the company was bad, not because he was unhappy in any dramatic way, but because he had spent a year discovering what genuinely interested him. And what genuinely interested him was not contained within his current job description. He wanted to work on the space between people and process, on making systems more human, on building experiences that respected human attention and human curiosity. No role like that existed at his company. He didn't have a plan for what came next. He had something better. He had a question he was genuinely curious about. And he had learned through 12 months of small experiments that genuine curiosity was the most reliable navigation tool he had ever used, more reliable than any plan he had ever made. He wrote in the notebook for the last time before leaving. Start small. Pay attention. Be willing to be wrong. Follow what is interesting, not what is impressive. Change course when you learn something new. Don't confuse the map for the territory. Then he closed it. He left on a Friday afternoon in August. His colleagues organized a small, slightly awkward farewell. Someone bought a cake. Someone gave a short speech. Marcus smiled and thanked them all and meant it. He walked out of the building into the afternoon sunlight. He had no idea what would happen next. He felt, for the first time in his adult life, genuinely open to finding out. He took a different route home. He always took different routes now. Sometimes they were longer. Sometimes they led somewhere interesting. Sometimes they just led home. The point was never efficiency. The point was noticing. The point was staying awake to the world that existed outside the plan. He passed a small bookshop in a neighborhood he didn't know. There was a handwritten sign in the window. He stopped and read it. "We don't know what you need, but we have some ideas." He smiled. He went in. There is an old question that philosophers have argued about for centuries. What is a good life? Is it a life of achievement, a life of meaning, a life of comfort, a life of virtue? Marcus didn't have a complete answer to that question. He suspected no one did. But he had something that felt more useful than a finished answer. He had a method. Run small experiments. Ask honest questions. Pay attention to what you actually discover. Treat yourself with the same patient curiosity that a good scientist gives to a new and genuinely interesting problem. Stop mistaking other people's measuring sticks for your own values. Build your identity through practice, not through declaration. Change your mind when the evidence gives you a reason to. And above all, stay genuinely curious about your own life. Not anxious about it, not driven by it, curious about it. The difference between anxiety and curiosity, Marcus had learned, turned out to be everything. A year earlier, he had sat at a kitchen table with cold coffee and asked himself a question he had never dared to ask before. What do I actually want? Now he knew the answer was not a single thing, not a title, not a finished version of himself. The answer was a practice, a way of moving through the world with open hands rather than closed fists, a willingness to run a small experiment and see what happened, rather than forcing the world to confirm the plan he had already decided on. What he had wanted, what he had always wanted underneath everything, was to be genuinely alive to his own experience, present in it, curious about it, willing to be changed by what he found. That was the experiment, not the 30-day photography project, not the Sunday pasta, not the onboarding guide. The experiment was the life itself, and the most important thing he had learned, the thing that stayed with him longest, the thing that changed the texture of every ordinary Tuesday that came after, was something almost embarrassingly simple. You don't need a perfect plan. You need the courage to begin, the patience to pay attention, and the honesty to follow what you actually find, rather than what you always thought you were supposed to find. The rest, it turns out, figures itself out.